Safe, reliable, free, and honest support. Qualities you cannot find online. Until now. Introducing the next generation of online technology support. What technology malfunctions are troubling you? Let us know today on the all-new support forums at www.theapplepost.com.
Welcome to Geek Cross, the podcast where faith and culture intersect. I am your host, Jeremy Yoder, and on each episode we will look at a topic related to pop culture or geekdom and have conversations that use science fiction, fantasy movies, gaming, or comic books as a jumping off point to talk about deeper issues and to wrestle with the big questions of life. Now, a couple weeks ago, I recorded an episode called When Churches Divorce Part 1. And in that episode, I talked a little bit about the upcoming convention for the Mennonite Church USA in Kansas City in early July, and the reality that the Mennonite Church is facing the potential of a split over the question of LGBTQ inclusion. Well, I'm recording this now on the other side of that meeting, and there's been a lot to process. Now, I realize this is a lot of inside baseball, and it may not be of a particular interest for a lot of people, and I apologize for that, but this is something that's been going on in my life. There's a lot of processing I have been trying to do about what's going on. It's incredibly painful. It's incredibly difficult. And so I do want to use this podcast as a bit of an opportunity to talk about some of the things that I've been experiencing about this and some of my thoughts, and perhaps explain a little bit to those of you who aren't Mennonites or who aren't Christians about what exactly is going on and what does it look like on the inside of a massive disagreement in the church about what it means to be faithful and what it means to follow Scripture. Just to sort of recap basically where we're at, is that the Mennonite Church USA is a denomination that has been around for only about 10 years. And the denomination was formed out of two different Mennonite traditions, the Mennonite Church and the General Conference. And these two different groups had completely different understandings of how decisions should be made. The General Conference was very congregational. That means that local churches were able to make most of their decisions, their theological decisions, their decisions about practice. And the Mennonite Church was conference-based, with an emphasis on power and authority of bishops, and that everyone who was a part of it had to sort of agree to certain basic theological positions. In a lot of ways, the meeting in Kansas City was really good. I wasn't a delegate. I didn't vote on any resolutions. When we get together, it feels like, in a lot of ways, like a big family reunion. I run into friends and colleagues, some of I haven't seen for many years. I ran into a former youth pastor of mine that I haven't seen in 20 years, and I was able to tell him that I'm a pastor, and there was so much joy that he expressed over that. It's in a lot of ways a lot of fun. There are often some really good seminars to talk about issues in the church and to hear different perspectives. The worship is often really well done. And all those things were in Kansas City. We took my daughters there. We put them in the children's programming. They loved it. They enjoyed it. They were connecting with other kids. It's really good in that sense. But this year was also a lot more painful than a lot of our biannual conventions have been in the past. Because, like I said, we're facing the possibility of a split. And there were two resolutions that dealt with this issue in a number of ways. The first was a resolution that was referred to as the forbearance resolution. And essentially what this resolution did was said, we have disagreement in the denomination about sexuality, about whether or not gays and lesbians and transgendered people can be included within the body, whether those relationships can be affirmed, or whether it is a sin and outside of God's intentions for humanity and for relationships. And the resolution said that we disagree here. And because we disagree, we're going to give space for churches and for conferences, for our regional conferences, to disagree and to develop their own practices and their own boundaries regarding it. One of the things that has blown up the issue is that my conference, the Mountain States Mennonite Conference, about a year and a half ago, licensed Theda Good as a pastor, as an associate pastor in Denver, and Theda is in a very committed same-sex relationship. And that sort of went against the denominational position, and since then, congregations and conferences are threatening to leave. The other resolution that was being discussed, the shorthand would be called the Membership Guidelines Resolution. Now, we actually, in the Mennonite Church, have a series of membership guidelines, which were adopted in the formation of the denomination because the conservative churches were concerned that the denomination was going to be too lax. And one of the things that the membership guidelines say is that pastors are not allowed to perform same-sex marriages. That's it. But from that, it's been taken to mean all kinds of things. Whether or not people who are in a same-sex relationship can be part of the church. What the Membership Guidelines Resolution did was affirm that position. And beyond that, it called for one of our executive bodies of the church that meets in between convention to function as elders. And so when one conference does something that's against the confession of faith, that is outside of the boundaries of the church, that can be then now peer reviewed and there can be discussion. Part of the problem is that there's been, at this point, no mechanism for anybody to come in and tell Mountain States Conference what to do. This would put that mechanism in. So there were two contradictory resolutions. One that gave space for conferences to choose their own beliefs and their own practices, and the other resolution which doubled down on the current position and added a mechanism to review and I guess put pressure on conferences to not go too far off the reservation. Both resolutions passed. And so I think that our executive board has created this mess here. One of the things that's been really kind of shocking about the membership guideline resolution is how badly written it was and how badly discerned it is. One of the questions that came up on the delegate floor about this resolution was, how long did the executive board, our executive leadership, discuss this resolution with the body that is going to be tasked to function as elders? The response, none. It was a resolution that was basically thrown together right before convention, and they hadn't any time of discussing the changes that they wanted to do in the structure of the denomination with those very parties that would be affected by this decision making. And I thought that was an extraordinarily poor leadership, and I was flabbergasted. In a lot of ways, it was a Hail Mary pass to try to keep the denomination together. And I don't think it's going to work. I think the problem here is a couple ways. It creates the expectation that conferences are now going to be able to hold other conferences accountable. But basically that means on this issue of sexuality, there are a number of Mennonite conferences that do not, for example, ordain women, even though that goes against the confession of faith. There is no discussion holding those accountable. But the problem is that it has been also my sense that by those who are now being tasked to do this accounting, this quote-unquote peer review, they don't want that role. They weren't asked if they wanted to have that role. They're being told, you're going to take on this role. And I suspect that nothing is going to happen. I suspect that this is all on paper and will have nothing to do with the reality of what actually happens on the ground. So what do I think about all this? Well, I think in some ways, it reveals that our executive leadership has no idea on how to solve this problem. Short of basically kicking out conferences and churches that allow gays and lesbians to be part of the church, that affirms their relationship, conservatives will not be happy. And they will leave, because that is sort of the DNA. That is our tendency. So if you have theological disagreement, one group usually leaves. So there's that entire issue. But also, I think it exposes that the structured ways that these things are supposed to work aren't working. I had a conversation with another young pastor who's about my age. He's more conservative than I am, and he remarked, we need less Robert's Rules of Order and more community. This is one of the things that was sort of the paradox of the meeting. When it came to the official delegate conversation, that stuff, there was a lot of anxiety, there was a lot of fighting, there was a lot of disagreement. But when it came to conversations that the delegates were having themselves at the tables that they sat at, there was a lot of more life-giving and listening and trying to have relationship and understanding where people came from. There's something about voting on positions, voting on resolutions, that isn't working anymore. A church that prizes efficiency and putting things on paper can be very efficient. It's not working. This bureaucracy, it's not working. And so I think in a lot of ways, this is the issue of that we're dealing with exposes that the attempt to hold differing beliefs together through carefully nuanced resolutions and polities and theological statements has failed. That it's not enough. I think in a lot of ways our confession of faith, which attempts to be very careful, very nuanced, uses words like teaching position, which is supposed to be less dogmatic, it hasn't worked. I think this document in a lot of ways was like a Rorschach test. Parties who were in the room when this was created had completely different understandings of the role that these documents, these foundational documents, would play in the life of the church. And now we're paying the cost of this disagreement. Another thing that I think that this convention exposed was the nastiness and the anger that exists in the church towards gays and lesbians. Now, there's an advocacy group for inclusion called Pink Menno. And for the last number of years, about 8 years or so, they've shown up at convention. They go to the delegate sessions, and at the beginning of the session, as the delegates are coming into the room, they sing hymns to them. It's a very kind of gentle protest, singing hymns, but it's a reminder that people are there. Well, on the Wednesday, that these documents, that these two resolutions were being considered, one group of Pink Mennos, a break-off group, went to the front of the stage and attempted to do some sort of satirical play about the delegate session. I was sitting in the back, and I was watching this. I couldn't hear what any of them were saying because as soon as people saw them, they started yelling and screaming at them. The moderator told them to turn off the microphones, started praying loudly in Spanish, and they went through their little skit, couldn't hear them, and people were yelling, and all of a sudden somebody started singing hymns to drown them out with a hymn. And I felt deeply grieved by that. I understand disagreement, but our worship and our music and our hymns, they're not weapons. You don't use them to drown out another person. And that for me was incredibly and deeply painful to witness my people in my church and my denomination acting this way. I think this exposes something terrible about us. I do want to acknowledge, though, that the pain that is being expressed, the pain that people felt, was more than just simply on one side. There are those in our denomination who feel deep pain at the fact that they believe that the church is now tolerating sin. Something has been upset, something has died for them, they are experiencing deep pain. One of the things that's really hard is that some of our non-Caucasian constituencies, such as Hispanic Mennonite Church, have indicated they're going to break relationship with the broader denomination over this issue. And that's all incredibly painful. It is like going through a divorce. As I've said before, about 1.5 years ago, I experienced some of this in my own congregation when we experienced a bit of a crisis after the decision to license Theta and people left. And I've had some relationship with some of the folks that have left. You know, I live in a small town. You run into each other. And whenever I run into these folks, it's always, everybody's always on their absolute best behavior. everyone's nice to each other, but it always feels very stiff and very formal. It's like we've gotten divorced. So what do I hope for in all of this? Right now I don't know where the church is going. I think it's very clear that that Christianity is losing power, is moving from the center of society to its margins. And I think that leaves many of us who are in the church and who are committed to the church with enormous amounts of anxiety and pain and grief. This Anglo-Protestant culture that has existed, that prized your traditional church service and your traditional church buildings and Robert's Rules of Order and efficiency and voting, all of this is dying. When we talk about sort of this culture war, as far as I'm concerned, the culture war is done and conservative Christianity lost. Traditional Christianity lost. And so now we are moving into something new and something unknown, and frankly, it is unclear what is going to survive and what is going to be able to adapt and continue. It is, I think, an incredibly difficult time, an anxious time, to be a pastor and to continue to serve a church that is dying, that is getting smaller, that is getting older, that is getting poorer. And so I think part of the challenge for myself is to continue to find where life continues to exist, where new life is coming through, what new things are happening, what new things are emerging in the midst of a denomination, in the midst of a local congregation that is dying. That's one reason why I do this podcast, because I seek life and I seek inspiration. And not all of that comes from the Bible, and not all of that comes from just Christian conversation. That I think there's a place for the secular and for the sacred to coexist with one another. I think it makes a lot of sense to look at geek things that are out there, comic books and movies, things that I love, and to draw theological meaning from that, to embrace those things. That's what I've been trying to do with this podcast, and to also have conversations with people who may not fit in with that small, tiny box of what it means to be a Christian, who have struggled with faith or who have walked away from faith, who have nothing to do with faith, and to find some space for us to have conversation about these things. I think on one level, church is the search for community. I also think that geekdom is a search for community, of finding people that you connect with, that over something you share a love for. And certainly my hope as the podcast continues, as we continue to be on this journey, as the church changes, as I continue to grow as a pastor, as I continue to embrace my inner geek, that we continue to find new places of life, that this is not the end, that things are not over, but that there's something new here. That's my hope. And so as I think about what happened in Kansas City a couple of weeks ago, as I think about the pain, there was also good things there. That people also experienced life. That my kids had a blast. That some other people there were excited about what they encountered, about the people they met, and the stories they heard. And so there is goodness in the midst of this kind of grief as well. I have grown so much as a pastor dealing with this crisis that was in my church after Theta got licensed. I learned so much about what it meant to lead and to lead well. I don't think this is the end of the church, but I think it's the end of church as we've always known it. But that there's something new, and it's something exciting, and it's something life-giving. So I want to thank you for allowing me to go on and on a bit about this insider baseball kind of stuff and the politics, and to talk a little bit about sort of where I feel some passion and some hope. If you like Geek Cross, you can help us out by leaving us a review on iTunes. You can email us at geekcrossshow@gmail.com. You can also find us on Twitter at our Twitter handle is at Geek Cross Show. I'm your host, Jeremy Yoder. This is a McLaren production. Thank you for listening.